I am Anna Seewald, and this is Authentic Parenting, a podcast about personal development in the context of parenting, where I explore how you can find more calm, connection, and joy in parenting through the process of self-discovery and inner growth with a trauma-informed lens. I'm a parent educator, and my mission is to help children by helping parents. The motto of this podcast is raising our children, growing ourselves. Today, the power of discord. Did you know that working through the messiness in relationships is the key to connection, trust, and resilience? You might think that perfect harmony is the defining characteristic of healthy relationships. Yet the truth is that conflict and messiness are not only okay, but crucial to our social and emotional development, to growth and intimacy. I am so excited to bring this conversation to you. I really want every parent to listen to it and hear its important message. I am speaking with two phenomenal guests, the authors of a brilliant book, The Power of Discord: Why the Ups and Downs of a Relationship Are the Secret to Building Intimacy, Resilience, and Trust. Dr. Ed Tronick is a developmental neuroscientist and clinical psychologist, is a university distinguished professor of developmental and brain sciences at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, where he is chief faculty of the Infant Parent Mental Health Program. He's a research associate in the Division of Newborn Medicine at Harvard Medical School and the author of 5 books and more than 450 scientific papers on social emotional development, parenting, and the still face paradigm, which he developed. Dr. Glaudia Gold is a pediatrician and writer who practiced general and behavioral pediatrics for more than 20 years and now specializes in early childhood mental health. She is on the faculty of the University of Massachusetts Boston Infant Parent Mental Health Program, the Brazelton Institute at Boston Children's Hospital, and the Berkshire Psychoanalytic Institute. She's the author of The Developmental Science of Early Childhood, The Silenced Child, and Keeping Your Children in Mind. Dr. Ed Tronick's classic still face experiment was a stunning demonstration of how babies are profoundly affected by their parents' emotions and behavior. This seminal work, which has influenced many relationship researchers, including John Gottman and Sue Johnson, reveals that while our highly evolved sense of self makes us separate, our survival depends on connection. If you're not familiar with the still face experiment, I encourage you to pause the podcast for a moment, watch the video on YouTube, it's only 2 minutes, and come back and continue listening. If you are familiar with the experiment, watch it anyway to refresh your memory. Dr. Ed Tronick and Glaudia Gold use a specific language when talking about conflict in relationships in their book: messiness, mismatch, repair, and meaning-making. In today's episode, we talk about the importance of repair, the timing of repair, what happens when repair and the lack of repair on the child's psyche, how early relationship patterns are not fixed or permanent. We discussed the notion of a good enough parent, perfectionism, and the too good mother. They also shared that by analyzing the data that they gathered after months of research, this connection was an inevitable part of interactions. It turned out, on average, 70% of the interactions were out of sync, and the repair was where the action was. So the most important part was not the mismatch, but the repair. We need mismatch because without it, we can't experience repair. Groundbreaking stuff. And now, please enjoy this very important, fascinating, and hopeful conversation with Ed Tronick and Glaudia Gold. Dr. Gold, Dr. Tronick, welcome to Authentic Parenting. I am deeply, deeply honored and so overjoyed to have you both here with me today.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Thank you.
First, I would love to know, how has the pandemic experience been for you personally, for both of you? You know, how have you coped? What have you missed about the pre-pandemic life? What was your overall experience?
Okay, I will jump in. Well, I have to say, overall, I've been incredibly blessed in that my professional life and my family life have all pretty much proceeded smoothly. I would say the hardest hit for me was my now 22-year-old son who graduated from college in May. And so I think his life had the biggest disruption developmentally. My husband's a musician. He plays music in the basement. I can see all my clients virtually. I can write. My daughter is in medical school, so her life has gone on pretty much, other than the kind of fear around COVID, on track. And I have healthy parents, elderly parents who I can take care of. So I feel very blessed overall.
I suppose in many ways, it's kind of a similar experience for me. My wife and I have been pretty much locked down since March 10th. It was right after we had a party in our house for the Infant Parent Mental Health Fellowship Program that Glaudia and I both teach in. And we had 50 people from all over the country in our house. And on that weekend and on that Tuesday, everything got shut down. And fortunately, no one in our group had the virus. No one had been exposed. Although since then, a number of our fellows have had the virus, and a number have had their family members and loved ones getting sick. The university where I work is completely shut down. If I want to go to university, for example, to visit my lab, although nothing is going on in my lab, to actually get permission to go on to the university. So the few times I've been there have been sort of spooky because all the hallways are empty and there are no students around. And of course, without students, the university in some ways doesn't exist. I have been supervising an honors student virtually. She's really quite wonderful, and we're working on a project that she'll be able to do virtually. My wife and I both feel pretty safe. My wife is a therapist, and she's doing therapy virtually with many of her clients. She's also a writer, so she's been writing pretty consistently. I've been able to do some work. I suppose the hardest part for me is that in the context of the safety that I feel, there are every so often a day or two or three where I feel really flat and I have little motivation to do something and really unable to get focused on work. So far, those haven't really lasted very long, but they do come pretty regularly. And it seems my friends also have similar kinds of experiences. So it both feels, it oddly feels safe, and at the same time, it feels somewhat discouraging. And right now, I have visions with the new varieties, the new mutants that begin to look to me like Cormac McCarthy's book, which probably many people have read, The Road. I've read much of Cormac McCarthy. He has a really disastrous view of the world. But I feel like something may be circling back on us and will create problems that while we're moving forward with the vaccine, something new is going to come along. And the state of the world, I think, is really quite terrible and quite disastrous in terms of how this is being handled. Mm. So all that to say is I feel like we're doing fine, and I feel like we're in a very serious set of problems.
I think my sense is I can resonate with your experience, Dr. Tronick, more personally. But regardless, your book, The Power of Discord, is such a positive, uplifting, and hopeful book, even though it's about discord, right? Right from the beginning, right from the title, it gives you hope, and it's something very positive. And I have to say, I read it twice, and I will never look at conflict or discord the same way again. I feel very relieved personally about discord. You normalize discord, and it affected me in my day-to-day life and parenting in a way that with that relief comes less reactivity, more presence, and compassion when I'm experiencing discord. So it's a pretty comforting understanding and knowing. I'm not sure if you have received such feedback, but that's the experience for me personally.
It certainly was what we wanted people to experience. So it's very gratifying to hear it had that kind of effect on you. When I first came to these ideas after looking at mother-infant interaction and realizing how much of the time during interactions, which we thought were so to speak, so wonderful, the ones that we really enjoyed seeing, how much time was spent with the parent and the infant really out of sync and working to get back into sync. That was surprising to me. I had, like many people, thought that the interaction, especially between a parent and an infant, would be one that was smooth and filled with positive emotions all the time, and a kind of very romanticized view of what was going on. So it was surprising, and I had to ask myself, why is there so much of this mismatching and this discord, as we call it? And what could be the really positive benefits of it? And framing it that way, I think, is reflected in your experience, is that the discord is really typical. Mm-hmm. And as you say, it's normalized. It's happening all the time. It's in fact, I think, unavoidable. You'll always have some of it. And most critically, we overcome it and we repair and we get back to states of connectedness and matching with each other. One of our good colleagues calls those, when you get back together, these moments of meeting. And these moments of meeting are very powerful in terms of our experience of ourselves and of the other person.
I have a kind of a fun question for Dr. Gold. In writing the book with Dr. Tronick, did you experience discord, and how have you mismatched and repaired throughout the whole process? I would only imagine, writing a book, doing a project together, that can bring up, differences in thinking, in choosing words, in choosing the cover art. I would love to hear your take on it. If you have a story.
I'm not sure I want to hear this answer.
Oh, it's all in love. So I love that question. Yes, there were many, many moments of discord from, some pretty, I guess, simple things about the length of time in which each of us respond to emails and our expectation around that, simple things like that. And then, more deeper conceptual things. But we really proved our point, I think, because we got through some really difficult moments of not seeing eye to eye on things. And I remember one in particular where Ed suggested that this very intricate title for a chapter. And I was like, what the heck? Because my role was kind of to be, the interface with everyday language. But then I really thought about it and I wrestled with it and I realized, it's really important what you're saying. And then I have to somehow find a way to incorporate it into the kind of language that we're using. So those moments were really difficult, but incredibly growth promoting, which is what the whole idea of the book is.
Yeah. What chapter was it? I can tell you my favorite chapter was chapter 10 on uncertainty. That was my favorite chapter.
Actually, the chapter, it became 2 chapters. And I think that was one, but it was actually Healing in a Mosaic of Moments Over Time was the chapter. Because Ed wanted us, I can't remember the phrase you used, but it was something about some kind of therapy that we have to talk about this kind of therapy. And I can't, maybe you remember the phrase.
I don't.
And it was actually one whole chapter and we ended up, which was the uncertainty chapter. And then we divided it into 2 separate chapters. And that was it, the Healing in a Mosaic of Moments Over Time.
And that kind of represents conflict and discord in life, right? When you look back and you said, what did we argue about? Right? We often forget that the main reason we even started an argument. How about choosing the title? Was that easy?
Well, choosing the title, let's say if I start, I think the phrase gets used is we had very little input on the choice of the title. And apparently that's pretty standard. I certainly had visions of the title that I knew was the absolutely correct one and would have been the best one. But it soon became obvious to me that I had very little voice in it. And actually that both of us had very little voice in it.
Yeah, it's purely a marketing decision. And I really wanted something hopeful. I wanted it to have something about repair and hope. And it's turned out, I think, to have been a really good idea to use the word discord. But initially, that was not, that didn't feel right to me.
Right. I think both of us wanted the idea of repair in the title somewhere. But when this was proposed to us, I think we both listened to the proposal. A key part of what we're talking about in terms of the mismatch and the repair is it's actually somewhat demanding of each of the individuals. It demands that you sincerely or authentically listen to what the other person is saying and that you actually consider it. Of course, you have to agree with it, but you work as hard as you can to see what's being said and to understand what's being said. And then, in a way, that helps, certainly for me, it helps clarify my own sense of what it is that I might want to do or how what's being proposed might actually potentially be better. Which is, we all have trouble thinking that someone could propose something better than we can propose ourselves. And working with the publishers and the editors, there was a lot of back and forth. about the title, our suggestions, Claudia's suggestions, my suggestions, our editor's suggestions. And over time, we moved into, I think, a domain that had it been left to, and you can comment on this, Claudia, had it been left to Claudia and I, we never would have gone into to the domain of some of the titles that were being proposed. And so there was, in that sense, a kind of new ideas were being presented, which we might not have generated on our own.
Yeah, I would definitely agree with that.
Yeah, Dr. Gould, I am wanting you to speak about when you changed your approach from managing to listening. I think it's such a powerful shift given your background. Do you still practice? Are you still practicing pediatrician? Do you still work with clients?
I have a very specialized practice. So I do infant parent consultations of kids 0 to 3 or sometimes up to 5 and their parents. And one part of my practice is specifically with families with substance use disorders. So, but I haven't done general pediatrics for about 10 years. But yes, I still feel that is kind of the core message, which I hope to convey in all of my work and writing to other pediatricians and other practitioners who interface with families, because it is so incredibly powerful when you make that shift, and also potentially significantly problematic if you don't, because you can kind of cover over or silence a child's communication if you don't take time to really listen to what their behavior is telling us. So I use it in my work every day. I do a lot of teaching, and I was actually on a call in our community where people are feeling very overwhelmed by the burden of struggles that families are dealing with, and trying to support them in listening, because listening often provokes a kind of panicky feeling that you have to do something because somebody is sharing with you their real struggles, and to help people to sit with that discomfort and not immediately feel the necessity to tell people what to do, which is something that people on the front lines of healthcare and mental health care really struggle with.
Yeah, it's so powerful. I really love that reading about behavior, and shifting that perspective completely as we see what's happening now. A lot of families are struggling, and people always want to fix, right? Either there's something wrong with my kid, fix my kid, or then maybe there's something wrong with me. I'm a poor parent. This is why I love this work. It gives you a completely different perspective.
If I could just, again, part of this comes out of the work that we've done looking at interactions between parents, mothers, fathers, other caretakers, and young infants. When I first started this work, the idea that infants had any kind of social capacities or that they had any sort of intentionality was really an idea that no one, that just generally wasn't accepted. And what we began to see in the interactions was, for example, that infants, 3, 4, 5-month-old infants, during interactions when there's a mismatch, that about almost half of the time, the infants are actually the ones who initiate the repair, rather than the parent feeling like the burden is always on them to do it, or the parents who feel like I need to be doing everything so that the baby will be okay. The phenomenon is that the baby really is half of the interaction. And I think then when we're with our patients and we listen to them, really what we're conveying to them is that we're conveying to them that I know you have ideas about what's going on. You have intentions about what's going on. And they're as important as the ideas that I have. And so together, maybe we can figure out, bring your ideas and my ideas together. Maybe we can figure out something that really works for you. And for therapists, certainly the junior therapists, the new therapists that I supervise, the push is for them to believe that they know the answers, to take care of everything, and that they should make sure it happens. And getting them to take a stance of, let's call it a stance of collaboration and a stance of unknowing, not knowing what the answer is difficult for everyone. And I think it's difficult for parents as well. Parents feel a very heavy burden to always know what it is that their child needs. It's really what they want to have happen. And you can only know that by letting the child, however they are able to, with their behavior or their words, speak to you.
Yeah. Dr. Gold, may I ask you to speak about a good enough parent and a too good parent or mother, I guess, and this culture of perfectionism?
So that phrase, the good enough mother, comes from one of the biggest influences on my professional life, D.W. Winnicott, who was a pediatrician and a psychoanalyst. So he had this great vantage point where he was immersed in the lives of parents and infants while at the same time practicing psychoanalysis. So he had his patients on the couch who, while they had full verbal capacities, they were kind of in a regressed place. So he put all these observations together, and I really feel there's a lot of Winnicott in the book, and it's so brilliant. But this idea is that it sometimes gets translated into it's okay to make a mistake, but that's not what it means. It means that the mistakes themselves, the mismatches themselves in Ed's language, are essential for a child to have an emerging sense of their own self and their own competencies. So that in the setting of the too good mother, where the mother is always perfectly available and there's never any mismatch, kind of squashes the child's sense of agency. And, sort of linking back to that idea of hope, is that the child develops a kind of sense of hope and resilience and that I can get through a difficult time because the mother or father or caregiver doesn't always get what they are trying to say. And they have these messy moments. Another key aspect of the good enough mother is that it's a developmental concept. So like a 2-week-old has a need for a much closer kind of attunement than, let's say, a 7-year-old who goes to school and gets involved in, the typical social conflicts with their peers, who has more of an ability to manage things on their own.
Mm-hmm. The mismatch, match, and repair, this process, what do children learn about the world, about themselves through this process? I would love to highlight some of the benefits of mismatch and repair in terms of the formation of the self, the emerging sense of self and trust in the world. You just started speaking about it. Can you say a little more about the benefits?
Sure. And then, I think that trust is certainly a central benefit of moving through this mismatch repair, because you get the sense that the other person will be there when you're at your worst and that you can survive a difficult moment. Resilience also is a core developmental process. People think of resilience as something you either have or you don't have, but it's really a developmental process that emerges by getting a sense over and over, hundreds of thousands of these micro moments where the other person doesn't quite get what you're saying. And then it feels uncomfortable and you feel very alone. And then you kind of figure each other out, and then you feel this kind of sense of pleasure and growth. So that's really embedded in this developmental moment-to-moment process in our earliest relationships.
Yes.
I was going to say, one way for people to think about it, I think, is in terms of adult relationships, where, in my experience, if people think about those relationships which are their most intimate, their strongest, their closest relationships, their partner, their really good friends. I think one of the things that happens there is that there are, in those relationships, matches, mismatches that you've repaired over periods of time, sometimes over, you know this person for years and there've been disagreements and you go back and forth. But your experience is that you're able to overcome the disagreements and you're able to maintain that feeling of caring and knowing this other person. And you come back together, and sometimes even some of the mismatches are more severe, where you have a bigger disagreement and one that even might be characterized with a stronger word rather than a mismatch. It's a kind of rupture that's going on. And yet, most people's experience in that is, given the way the relationship has been over the years, you know and you trust the other person and you know that you can repair it. So in an odd way, my wife and I talk about this, when you really know that you can repair pretty much whatever is happening, then sometimes you can even get more extreme in your mismatch in the argument because you know you can overcome it. So people act out a little bit.
They feel safe, right?
Right. You feel really safe. It's not only that you feel safe, it's that both of you know that we can put this back together and that it doesn't really threaten the core of our relationship and the way we are with one another. And certainly for parents and infants are coming to know that because of the parents working so hard to create those repairs and those moments of meeting and for them to get back together again. And then the child comes to know, oh, we can do this together. I can do this with my mom. I can do this with my dad.
I want to, I'm really fascinated by the still face experiment. Of course, I'm not the only one. I use it in my work when I teach early childhood educators or when I work with fathers who go through court-ordered parenting classes. So this is very, very close to me, this experiment. And it seems like it's as old as I am. I was born in 1974, and it sounds like the still face experiment is older than me. Is that right?
I think I began working on this still face probably in 1971 or 72. So yes, it is older than you. And the first time I presented it was in 1975 to the Society for Research in Child Development, to a big convention.
And have you kept in touch with the first person who ever came in through the doors, the first subject of this experiment? Or there is no point in that?
Well, I distinctly remember the very first 3 mothers and infants who came into the lab for this study. I know their names, I know their children's names. Their children are now, they're probably in their 50s, in fact. And while I didn't keep in touch with them, I met each of them later on. I met one of the parents in Tennessee in a parking lot where I happened to be, and there she was, and now her then, what had been her 5-month-old infant was now about 7 years old, but we recognized each other immediately and we talked about it. And she distinctly remembered the experience, and I remembered everything about what her son had done during the experiment. So it seemed like they were thriving, and it was wonderful to see them. And every once in a while, after a talk or something like that, someone like yourself will say, I was a baby in your experiment. Or a parent will say, oh, I was at Children's Hospital with you doing this experiment back in, 1985 or something like that.
Dr. Gold, I want to know how all of this knowledge informed your own parenting. It sounds like your child is an adult now. I don't know how many children you have, but how were you informed by this work in your personal parenting journey?
Well, I have three. I have a 22-year-old son, a 26-year-old daughter, and a 32-year-old stepdaughter. So, and my journey of discovery sort of paralleled their growth. So when they were born, I was just a general pediatrician. And I really learned this stuff as they were growing up. I think it gave me a healthy respect for the fact that you can have all these ideas, but they can really become derailed when your fear really about your child kind of overwhelms you. So it's all well and good when you're talking about it in theory, but when you have the enormous emotional investment of it being your child, it's a whole other story.
Dr. Tronick is laughing. I'm curious what story he has to share.
Well, how to start this story. Of course, I was working with infants. I have a daughter who's now, God bless her, 42. And she's a marvelous, marvelous parent. And I had marvelous experience with her. And, I was already doing infant research, had been doing it for a number of years, had already done the still face experiment when I had her. And of course, I thought I knew everything there was to know about parenting. So we could characterize me as, let's say, being somewhat arrogant in the depth of my knowledge, except, of course, what Glaudia says is true. I wasn't prepared for the kind of emotional feeling that you have when it's your child, as opposed to just, watching other parents take care of their children. And as much as this still face influenced me, because it gave me a really powerful sense that, in a way, I already believed that the infant was a critical part of the interaction, and the infant was really affecting what was going on. I also, at the same time, had these wonderfully lucky experiences of studying child rearing in several different cultures. And that included a group of hunters and gatherers or foragers in the Ituri forest in the Congo, where their pattern of child rearing was completely different than anything I had seen before. I worked with a group in Kenya where, for example, instead of the playfulness that we see in our interactions where we're playing with an infant and we build them up to a smile and we all get really excited. And this was a group where if the baby got too excited, in a little bit like the still face, mothers would look away because they had very strict rules of when you could look and what kind of emotions you could express between adults and children. And then I worked with a group in Peru where the baby for the first months of life, to overstate it a bit, is completely wrapped up and carried very much like in a cocoon over time. Having worked with all these groups and having seen these really radically different ways that people were raising their children. The foragers were always carrying their infants. In our studies, we never saw the infant really just be put down on the ground. The infant was always held by someone, whereas in Peru, the infant was on the mother's back and the baby was wrapped up and there was very little interaction. That what it made clear to me, and I hope it comes through in the book, is that there isn't one way to raise one's child, that the variety is enormous and that children thrive in the context of a cultural context in which the child is being incorporated into the way the people see the world, the way the culture wants us to understand the world. So, for example, we tend to be very interactive with our children, and we treat them as if they're conversational partners. We're always talking to them. We're always playing games with them. The foragers would carry the child all the time, but engage in very little play with them. But the children also were taken care of by many other people at the same time. So they learn a range of social skills, which I think is really quite different than the range of social skills our children. Our children learn how to be with one or two or maybe three people. The foraging children learn how to be with 6 or 7 or 10 people. And so their worlds are emotionally very different. But that underlying process of mismatch and repair is there are mismatches, and then they repair to fit to the culture that they're part of. And that's the way the culture gets incorporated into the child, and even starting in infancy. So it meant with my daughter that I could be messing up all the time, and I could think, well, it's okay. We'll figure out what to do. It made me much more relaxed.
I'm interrupting this conversation to ask you to take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts if you're listening on an Apple device. It's very easy to do, and you can do it with me as I guide you through the steps. Minimize your current screen, go to your podcast app, click on the shows, tap on the Authentic Parenting cover art, then scroll down until you see ratings and reviews. If you only want to rate, simply tap on the number of stars you want to give to the show, and I hope it's 5. Then you'll get a message on your screen that says submitted. Thanks for your feedback. If you're feeling more generous, then you can write a couple of sentences and share why you love this podcast. In that case, click on the write a review. Once you are done, click send. That's it. You only need to do this once, and your overall rating and review goes to the entire show, not just a particular episode. I can't wait to receive new ratings and reviews. Thank you so much. And now, please continue listening to this wonderful conversation. So in analyzing those videotapes, the still face experiment videotapes, it turned out that the repair was the most important, crucial part, right? I would love for you both, maybe Dr. Gold, who's been sitting there a bit quietly, participate here. Talk about the average 70 to 30%, when we're in sync, when we're not. And why is the repair so important? What is it about the repair process that is so crucial?
So the 70-30 number is very interesting because, well, that was sort of the accumulation of the data from a lot of research. And I have been in meetings with like home visitors or all sorts of different practitioners who interface with families, and they use that, but they don't really know where it comes from. So it kind of got separated from the research as a kind of truth. But that's what it is that in healthy, typical families, interactions are really mismatched up to 70% of the time. And that, again, as long as the majority are repaired, development proceeds in a healthy direction. And so, we've alluded to some of these ideas already, that the repair is a source of pleasure, which is very significant to our emotional well-being. It's a source of hope because really, if you think about what what hopelessness is hopelessness is a kind of sense that I will forever be in this state. So when you have had the experience of being in a stressful place and then moving to the pleasure of repair, then you develop that core sense of hope. So, and also the repair is growth promoting. It's like fuel. It's like, that's what drives our change, both individually and in relationships, and even in societal change, is fueled by the process of repair, as opposed to kind of things being smooth and unchanging and stagnating.
Mm-hmm. Can you speak about the timing of the repair? Let's say a mismatch happened. Is the repair needed to be immediate? What is this going to do if the repair is a little prolonged, or there is no repair? I would love for you to speak about the timing of the repair and its impact on the relationship or on the development of the child.
I'll take a stab first.
Yes.
So first of all, I think it's developmental. I mean, the time is different, whether you're an infant or toddler or even an adult, that you have the capacity to kind of hold yourself together until you get to the point of repair. And I'm going to make another reference to Winnicott, because Winnicott talked about, he actually puts it in terms of X plus Y plus Z. So if it's sort of X plus Y, you can kind of hold on to that sense that the other person still exists and that you still exist. But if it gets to be the extra Z, that beyond that time, then for an infant, and a young child, it can actually get to the point where you don't have in your mind an idea that the other person still exists. And if the other person doesn't exist, then you don't exist either. And that's this kind of existential threat that, calls to mind the horrific circumstances of the separations at the border, and how when the separation is really beyond the child's ability to hold the relationship in their mind, that it can have these really devastating effects.
How about throughout childhood, let's say the middle childhood or teenage years, or adult relationships? I mean, in adult relationships, sometimes we can give each other a cold shoulder for days. I would love for you to speak about this a little more, as I think I have a personal interest, I guess.
I'll just say one more thing.
Yes,
because
please.
I think that gets to be more complicated, because it depends on the kind of emotional state of the individuals involved when you get into adulthood. So if you are feeling like very sort of calm and together, then you're much better able to tolerate working through a point of discord. Whereas if your sense of self is already kind of fragile because of all sorts of other stresses, then your need for the other person to, in a sense, hold you together might be greater. So it really just depends on a lot of different factors when you get into adult relationships.
So the early patterns of relating, they're not fixed, right, or permanent. They change throughout our life, and we get wounded in relationships, and we get healed in relationships. And that's what I loved about your book on healing and uncertainty. The last couple of chapters of the book was very powerful. But how about depressed mothers in terms of mismatch and repair?
What we saw partially as an outgrowth of the still face experiment, where we're having the mother not react to the infant, was we began a set of studies which focused on conditions that might be really disruptive to the process of mismatch and repair. And one of those was working with mothers who had high levels of depressive symptoms, or really quite depressed, or had other similar kinds of issues. And the first study we ever did with that was, we were kind of cautious in doing it. So we actually had mothers simulate being depressed. So we them into the lab. We asked them to simulate, to act like they would on the days that they were feeling blue or down or flat. And we had videotapes of one of my research assistants acting that way, where her voice was flat and she was moving slowly or whatever. And we almost never had to show the video to the mothers because all the mothers would say, oh, I know exactly what that. So they all had experienced that. And so they would act that out with their infant. And what we saw with the infants was a reaction of their turning away, of their getting upset, their looking sad, and their disengagement from the mothers. And of course, there was this lengthening of time during which there would be mismatches. So the mother is not very excited. She's looking off to the side. She's looking past her infant. The infant's looking away. And that disconnect between them would last for 10 seconds, 15 seconds. Because in the typical interactions, the repair goes on every couple of seconds. They don't last very long. And then we studied women who had high levels of depressive symptoms or were depressed. And what we found there was that they expressed, the mothers expressed less positive affect, although they did show some positive affect. Their voices tended to be flatter. And probably most important was that the time to repair, the latency to repair a mismatch really grew. And when I say really grew, it was going from, in typical interactions, most take place within 8 or 10 seconds. We were now seeing interactions where the mismatch would last maybe 25 seconds, maybe 30, which if we were to stop talking now and just watch each other for 30 seconds, you get a sense of how long a period of time it is for that to be occurring. And what we found for the infants was that when those repairs failed, the infants showed more negative affect. They looked away more. Their facial expressions were flatter. And the other thing that we found was we looked at the cortisol level of infants. So cortisol is a stress hormone, and you can measure it by getting saliva from the infant and then evaluating what it was. And the remarkable finding that we had was that the longer it took on average for a given mother and infant to repair the interaction, the higher the level of cortisol in the infant. So it really spoke to how the infants were getting stressed by this long duration mismatch and how it was affecting them emotionally and physiologically. So it was really changing the way they were experiencing the world. Mm. And again, it's not simply the depression, it's the distortion of the interactive process that really is costly for the infant.
Mm. There was another study that I would love for you to speak about where the mother is... the mother, before the interaction with her own baby, listens to a cry of another baby and how it changes, even though there are no visible signs that you can see in the mother's demeanor, but the child senses that there's something not all right energetically or emotionally. I would love for you to speak about that as well, because that's so huge, especially now that everyone is so overwhelmed. Yes. And, we're just affecting each other's nervous systems mm-hmm. and we're not even aware of it.
Right. The idea was to try and figure out a way to experimentally, because that's, I guess, what I am as an experimentalist, is to experimentally manipulate the stress that a mother might be experiencing. And what we came up with was based on other research, was the idea that mothers could listen to the cries of infants. Some of these cries were cries of infants who were ill or had neurologic problems. So they were really disturbing. When we asked mothers to rate how disturbing they were quite disturbing. And the contrast that we had was mothers listening to the gurgles and coos of infants. So we had two groups, one group listening to the cries, one group listening to the gurgles. And we also showed them pictures of infants, sometimes preterm infants or full-term happy infants. So they were getting visual and auditory information that the baby was either was disturbed and distressed, or the baby was doing fine. And they'd listen to it on earphones, and their baby wouldn't see them listening to it. But anyway, in the experiment, what we found was that the infants of mothers who listened to the cries, when those mothers now began to, a typical regular interaction following listening to the cries with their baby. So now that we just say now, okay, go ahead and play with your infant, that more than half of those infants got upset and dropped out. We had to stop the experiment compared to the infants of mothers who heard the positive vocalization. In that group, only one infant got upset. So there was the infants were telling us something that they could tell that their mothers had been stressed, and that stress was affecting what was happening, how they reacted. What was amazing, though, was when we went to look at the behavior of the mother, because we figured, oh, there'll be something that we can see, which will tell us what the infants are seeing. Mm. But we as adults, when we were coding the mother's behavior from videotapes, the two groups of mothers looked very much the same to us, right? They sound like their vocalizations were the same. Their repair rate was pretty much the same. It was a little slower, but not very much in the stress group. They smiled the same amount. And yet the babies were saying, oh, my mom was stressed. Something's wrong here. And then what we did was we analyzed using computer technology the vocalizations of mothers. And what we found there was a big difference between the two groups of mothers. The mothers who had been stressed, their vocalizations were slightly higher in pitch. So you're talking, when you get more anxious, your pitch goes up. They had less prosody in the voice, less playfulness in their voice. And there were a number of other features that were different between the two groups of mothers. What was amazing was we as adults, and even after I knew these differences, I could not hear the differences between the stressed mothers. And so even though I'm biased and now I know what I'm looking for, I couldn't hear it, right? Well, I'm an old guy. My research assistants couldn't hear it either, but the infants could hear it. So the infants were more sensitive to what the mothers were doing and the stress on the mothers than we as adults were able to pick up on. And I think when we think about parents now being under sort of the constant stress of worrying about the pandemic and the virus, being at home, not being able to do their work, worried about how their children are doing. So their stress levels are really, really increasing. And my sense is that it has these effects. Their interactions are more stressful for their infants through no fault of their own. It's just that the stress is building up and it makes them less effective in their interactions with their infant, and that their infants are picking up on it. So you get a lot of reports of how infants are upset and they're cranky and they're not sleeping, all the kinds of things that speak to infants and young children being under stress. But it's probably also true with older children. The parents are home all day, the kids are home with their parents. They're both stressed and they're both doing it to each other. So they're both picking up cues from the other that I'm stressed, you're stressed, and we have more trouble figuring out how to repair, how to match up.
Yeah. Dr. Gould, I'm wondering what you have to say about this in terms of this pandemic. What might the long-term consequences be of this kind of existence, right? Mothers and parents and children living in close quarters with this pandemic, with increased threat and anxiety and uncertainty. What are the long-term, in your opinion, consequences in terms of their development, our children's development? Are the consequences going to be irreparable, or it depends on a family? I would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, I would say there are no few consequences that are irreparable. That's kind of the whole idea. So I don't know. We don't know. This is a totally unknown situation. My hope is that what also changes is the investment of our society in parents, because before the pandemic, things were pretty bad in terms of the support we give families around the birth of a baby and support for childcare, parental leave. We as a culture do a terrible job with that as a baseline. So we're going to have a lot of families who have been living under really just superhuman conditions. Like their mothers, there's been a whole slew of articles recently about what mothers are being asked to do, and fathers, is just insane. So there will be some consequences, but again, I don't know what they are. But I do hope that a result is that resources are kind of poured into supporting families as our society as a whole begins to repair from this massive disruption.
Mm.
I think the research, the small experiment that we've done where we're inducing stress, speaks to the consequences of what are very real and very powerful, and what are sort of constant ongoing stresses. I mean, we do an experiment and we stress a mother and it takes 2 minutes to do it and then it's done. And yet we see effects. But what does it mean when all day long you're under pressure? You're worried about, can you go out and get food for your kids? Are you going to have enough food for your kids? If you go out, is it dangerous to go out? If they go out, is it dangerous for them to go out? So there's just this building up all the time of a chronic level of stress and anxiety that affects how you're able to engage the world, because you're using so much of your resources, your psychological, even physical resources, to deal with the stress, to keep yourself under control, to keep calm, that you have less resources available to do the things that you'd really like to do. I mean, what I said at the beginning, where there are days that I feel really flat and unable to do it. I'm sure that part of that is just the days leading up to that, where I'm thinking about the virus, thinking about the work that's not being done, thinking about my grandchildren who I'm not seeing, worrying about how they're doing. And it just goes on. And then finally one day, it's like all my resources are gone. And I just kind of shut down and need to recuperate. People are under so much more stress than I'm experiencing. And their worries and fears are so much greater. So the policies we talk about are policies which help to make people safe and to allow them to have resources to engage positively with the world, rather than to always be constantly using all their resources to to cope with the stressors that they're experiencing.
I just want to add a word about loss and grieving, because I think actually I just went, my dog passed away last weekend, and I went to pick up his ashes, and I was, really gave myself time in the car to mourn that loss by myself. And it just, since this was so recent, I'm just thinking about how much loss people have experienced, both in terms of death of loved ones, but loss of things they thought they were going to do with their lives. And so I think that in addition to these kinds of societal supports for families that we need, is just to acknowledge that loss and to really grieve the things that we've lost in the year with the grandchildren and all of those things, because you have to really move through that grief to be able to begin to heal. So I just wanted to add that thought.
Yeah, I'm very sorry about your dog. Yeah, I've been talking and writing about loss and grief, since this pandemic started. I've been through a severe earthquake when I was 13. And, I draw parallels between this experience and the earthquake, in terms of loss, uncertainty, fear, disruption, life not being the same normal when it will go back to quote unquote normal. Even though I have this training in terms of resiliency, I guess, but I see people around me, how, each individual is suffering and struggling in their own way, right? Some people are more resilient, some aren't. And your work, is very timely and very relevant, this book particularly. So what is one message that Dr. Gold and Dr. Tronick, you want to impart, you wanted the listener, the reader to gain from this book, if you were to condense into one message, that is, one central point?
I would say that we can, in the midst of tremendous stress and adversity, find hope in moments of meeting with people who are important in our lives, and to maintain that kind of mindful focusing on those moment-to-moment connections, because those strung together over time will be how we find our way forward.
And I would agree. I think the biggest cost that most of us experience at this time that is the loss of relationships, and the loneliness that we come, even if we're home with people, the loneliness that comes with it, and the stressors on relationships. And it's a kind of moment by moment, and it's just an ongoing, continuous kind of process. And so finding ways to connect with people, be it virtual connection or at home connection, saving time when you're home with your 12-year-old son who's virtually in class or whatever, but then making some time to be together as opposed to just in the house together. Trying to find things that you can do together and share together for some periods of time. Those are experiences that build resources for us, that enhance our experience in the world. And it's the relationships, as much as anything else, that is really so costly during this period of time.
Yeah. If you were to go back in time, knowing what you know about, all this work, research, parenting, what would you say to yourself as a new parent? I would love to hear your thoughts on this question, and then we will end.
I know what I
said. Well, think about that.
I'll let you think about it. I know what I said, which was, when things were not going well, and of course I didn't always believe this, But when things were not going well, say in taking care of my daughter, I would say to myself, okay, it's not going well. This is a disorganization, but something good will come out of this. That, yes, she seems to be suffering a lot. She's really upset, but we'll get past this. And then she'll know that we can get past this. Now, that didn't always work, but it allowed me to not be quite so anxious about demanding of myself that it be perfect. To be perfect is impossible. And to see the possibility that when it's not going well, when there are mismatches, that it's one, not the end of the world, and two, that something really positive can come out of it, can take that edge off of that experience and give you a little confidence to keep on moving forward. So you're hopeful.
So I think that I would have wished that I was more present in the moment, like not so caught up in the big long-term picture and realizing this idea that it's what's happening in the moment-to-moment interactions that's really the value. And I think I probably missed some of those. I wasn't fully paying attention in the way that I would like to if I could do it again.
Your work reminds me of Dr. Barbara Fredrickson's work about Love 2.0. Are you familiar with her work and her book?
I'm not. Are you?
I'm familiar a little bit with it.
Yeah, she talks about this micro moments of connection and resonance. And it's very similar almost to your work, her book. That love is those micro moments of connection, and she completely makes you shift your perception and understanding of love as an emotion. And that's what I drew parallels between your book and her book.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And if I can say, it was really the developmental researchers, my colleagues, myself, where we focused on looking at really second by second, moment by moment interactions. And we saw how there was this flow of emotions. And now we know there's also this flow of physiology that goes with it, that you could see how something in the moment could have a really powerful effect on what came next. And then that would affect the next moment. So we really began to build models of relationships which talked about the moment by moment changes and how those accumulate over time. They can accumulate into feeling trust and feeling love. The idea that you can repair an interaction with this person, but not another person. The idea that you can repair with your parent or your brother or your sister or your lover. That's part of the process of feeling love for that person, because you have that confidence and that you recover that moment of connection with them.
Hence the mosaic of that title of that chapter, the mosaic of relationships or life. I can't remember, right? It's a mosaic, right?
Yes.
I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for your time and your presence, for your wisdom, for your work. And I want to extend a warm virtual hug to both of you. I wish you well and safety and health. And just thank you so much. It was truly an honor and pleasure.
Well, thank you. It's been such a treat to speak with you.
It was a wonderful, wonderful period of time. Thank you.
That concludes today's conversation, my dear listener. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. What's your biggest takeaway? What's your biggest aha? Did you find it useful? How you may apply what you gleaned from this episode into your own life, relationships, parenting. I want to hear from you. You can send me a note to the email info@authenticparenting.com. You can call the number 732-763-2576 and leave a voicemail. And for international listeners, you can use the free SpeakPipe tool on the contact page of my website, authenticparenting.com/contact. To access the full episode show notes, visit authenticparenting.com/267.